We can start. So, welcome everybody to the webinar of today. The speaker of today is Michel Speetjens, and he is going to talk about Lagrangian Transport and chaotic advection from fundamentals to applications. So, as usual, I introduce the speaker briefly, and then I leave him the floor. So Michel Speetjens received his PhD in physics in 2001 at Eindhoven University of Technology in the Netherlands on mixing in 3D laminar flows. After that, he embarked in a 2-year postdoc project at CSIRO in Melbourne, Australia, during which he contributed to the development of the rotated arc mixer using scientific insight into Lagrangian chaos. Subsequently, he did a 2-year postdoc project at the University of Technology in Aachen, Germany, on modeling and nonlinear dynamics of boiling heat transfer. In 2006, Michel Speetjens returned to Eindhoven University of Technology for a position as assistant professor in the research group of energy technology, fluid dynamics, and Department of Mechanical Engineering. He was appointed associated professor on thermal transport in laminar flow systems in 2017. His research concentrated on thermal transport phenomena in fluid flows using methods from mathematical physics and nonlinear dynamics, and applications of scientific insights on these subjects to design, optimization, and control of processing equipment and energy systems. So it's with great pleasure that I introduced Michel Speetjens for the seminar of today. So Michel, I stop the screen share. You can start sharing the presentation.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Francesco, for your introduction. So that technology doesn't abandon us today. So this is the title of my talk, Lagrangian Transport and Fluid Flows from Fundamentals to Applications, and it's a very general talk, a very general title. So I'm Michel Speetjens from Eindhoven University of Technology. I'm an associate professor at the moment. Okay, let's see. Yeah. Okay. Some acknowledgements. So this is a list of people that have contributed to the work that I'm about to present. I will not mention all of those individually, but I just show the names. And on the right of the screen, you can see several agencies that have made our research possible over the years. So this with respect to the acknowledgements. And okay, what is now the scope and the motivation in general of our work? Well, that is scalar transport, and that can be anything from concentration on pH values, for example, in deterministic flows. And that actually happens in quite a lot of different flow systems. So there can be an industry, for example, and mixing internal processing of physics fluids, small systems outside of industry, so for example, nutrient transporters. And the list is actually much longer than that. Turbulent flows, they also can fit within this category. We know quite a lot about transport phenomena. All the insights are still, of course, incomplete. And that is our general motivation, to deepen the insights in these types of systems. Okay, a brief outline of my presentation. I will first of all discuss a number of basic concepts with respect to Lagrangian transport to make it accessible for you, because I presume that not everybody of you is an expert in this type of material. So I will introduce first of all some basic concepts, and then I will actually discuss 2 topics. So it's a very broad title, but there's only limited time. So I will actually zoom in on 2 topics that we have been working on. The first topic is the application sizes and design of industrial inline mixers. And the second topic is of a more fundamental nature, where we use those same concepts to study 3-dimensional transport phenomena and unsteady flows. And in both cases, it will consist of a computational analysis and connected with that experimental validation to ensure that all we study is also relevant in practice. And I will end then with a number of concluding remarks. Okay, but first of all, some general concepts then. Well, transport basically involves 2 transport mechanisms. That's first of all advection, and that is the distribution of material elements throughout the flow, and also the deformation. So you start out with a circular blob, and that deforms typically into something like this, a filamental structure. that is advection, transport by the fluid flow. And across the interface of that fluid element and the environment, we have diffusion. So in general, transport has those two contributing mechanisms. But within the scope of my talk, I will only focus on the first part of that transport, namely the advection by the fluid motion. And that is dominant in the case of very high Peclet numbers. So the advection over the diffusion is characterized by the Peclet number. And if that is much smaller or larger than 1, then advection dominates. And we can largely describe this transport by zooming in on just advection. That will be the scope or the restriction of my presentation, advection only. And okay, how can we now investigate that advection? Yeah, in terms of the Lagrangian fluid parts. So what we have is some fluid element starting at a position x0, and that will move in the course of time along a certain path because of the flow. And x is then the position of the fluid element in time, and u is then the fluid flow in which that fluid parcel is moving. And this is now the flow, which is the formal solution to the kinematic equation. And we now zoom in on these paths that fluid elements follow. And we do that usually in terms of the geometry and the topology of these fluid parts. And what you see here is a very simple example of just streamlines in the wake of a cylinder. And that reveals certain coherent structures. Because these fluid parts, in this case the streamlines, they usually have a particular organization due to, for example, continuity or symmetry. And that is the level at which we investigate transport, at the level of this type of coherent structures that form in these fluid trajectories. And we often refer to this as the so-called flow topology, so the geometry or the topology of the flow. So that's the approach from which, or the approach by which we investigate transport in the scope of Lagrangian transport studies. And interesting to know is that there is also a particular kind of advection, namely chaotic advection, which is very relevant for practical applications. And I will briefly illustrate what that means, chaotic advection. And I do that by way of a very simple toy flow. So what we have here is some square cavity, and that cavity flow is driven by the motion of these two side walls. So this wall can move upward, this wall can move downward, and if you only move the left wall, then this is the streamline pattern, just one global circulation. If you only translate the right wall, then this is the circulation. And we simply now alternate between those two flows. And that sets up a time periodic flow. And this is now the toy problem in which I will briefly demonstrate what is the difference between chaotic versus non-chaotic advection. And I do that by way of simply releasing in that flow two blobs of material, a red blob and a blue blob. And now let's simply see what happens if they evolve with the flow. So I have a nice animation prepared for that. So now we see all these two blobs start to evolve in the flow, and the arrows now indicate the direction of travel of the sliding wall and also the length, the velocity of that wall. But the main thing is that in this flow, we see these two blobs, so the blue one and the red blob, gradually develop completely different behavior. So the blue blob remains relatively compact, it deforms a little bit, but not that much. It simply moves around. But the red blob, on the other hand, shows completely different behavior. We see really stretching and folding, and stretching and folding. And that difference becomes more and more dramatic in the course of time. And this goes on for a little while. But at some point, when you stop the simulation, you will see that these two initial blobs, both circular, the red one and the blue one, have evolved into completely different patterns. And the blue element only undergoes minor deformation, and that is non-chaotic advection. The red element undergoes dramatic deformation, stretching, folding, evolving in this very complicated pattern. And this is chaotic advection. So this is a nice visual illustration of the difference between chaotic and non-chaotic advection. And yeah, for applications, it's often interesting to know how well a flow mixes. And if you want to establish good mixing in a laminar flow, then this is what you want, chaotic advection. So this whole concept of chaotic advection will be very useful to investigate the mixing properties of laminar flows. And that is exactly what we will do in this first topic, this more application-oriented topic, namely using Lagrangian transport studies for the analysis and design of industrial inline mixers. And what is an inline mixer? Well, the basic principle is shown here. It's basically a pipe along which an axial flow is taking place, driven by a pump. And inside that pipe, there are, for example, baffles, which lead to a transverse flow. And that is the basic idea. You have some axial flow, and via internal elements in this particular case, you have a reorientation of the transverse flow, and that leads to mixing. That is how a inline mixer in industry works, and they are actually widely used. So standard equipment for polymer processing, for example, uses this principle, but also smaller scale devices for process identification, so small scale heat exchangers, and even microfluidic devices use that same principle. So it's a very common principle in the industry. And if you want to develop those systems further, so to make them more efficient, to make them more versatile and more controllable, we need deeper insight into the mixing behavior inside these systems. And therefore, we need a scientific approach to really from the fundamentals on, try to understand and optimize these devices. So here is a type of system, namely inline mixers, where we will use these fundamental concepts from Lagrangian Transport to design and optimize these devices. And I will use a case study for that, the rotated arc mixer. And the schematic of the rotated arc mixer is shown here. So that is also a pipe, basically, with an axial flow driven by a pump. And the inner part of that RAM, rotated arc mixer, is a stationary cylinder with windows cut out of it. And fit around that is a cylinder that rotates. So that is the construction of the rotated arc mixer. And it effectively works as follows. So here we have that inner stationary cylinder. This is the axial flow. Here we have windows, and because of this rotating outer cylinder, I generate an internal flow in the transverse direction. So here at this first window, you see this transverse flow. This is the streamlined pattern of the local transverse flow. And the subsequent window has an offset in the angular direction, and that results in the same flow, but then reoriented. And the same with the next window. So you have these actually offset windows in the downstream direction, and that effectively leads to a reorientation of the transverse flow while you are moving in the downstream direction. So that is the principle, or that is the particular way in which this inline mixing principle is implemented in this rotated arc mixer. So this is our case study, and this is an actual device that you can purchase for industrial applications. Okay, so let's now analyze the mixing properties of the device, and then first of all via simulations. And the strategy is now to identify coherent structures. We saw before that Lagrangian transport studies, they focus on identifying coherent structures, and from that determine what the mixing properties are. Well, that is exactly what we will do here. So what you see here is a bunch of spaghetti, basically, and all those black trajectories are streamlines inside the three-dimensional streamlined pattern inside this rotated arc mixer. At first sight, it looks like a disorganized bunch, may suggest good mixing. But we can identify coherent structures in this streamlined pattern. And first of all, we can identify certain, I just call them special stream tubes. I don't want to bother you too much with technical details. So for sake of simplicity, I just call them now special stream tubes, like for instance this red one. And they tend to entrap material, because if material ends up at the inlet of such a special stream tube, it stays inside. It can never leave that. And the blue one encircling the red one is another special one. And this light blue one is actually circling around that. So we can identify sets, in this case, of special stream tubes, highlighted in color here. And they all entrap material. And this is a 3D picture. This is then the cross-section at the inlet. So here you see these stream tubes emerging as these islands, these colored islands. And they result in poor mixing because they trap material and that prevents mixing. But around that, this remaining black part is a chaotic zone. And in that local chaotic zone, we have that chaotic advection that I have demonstrated before. So if you now connect that with this previous simple illustration, then inside the stream tubes, we see behavior what we saw with the blue blob. Blobs remain compact, bad news for mixing. And in that black region, we see this stretching and folding, which is characteristic of chaotic material. So locally, we have good mixing. So this notion of certain coherent structures existing in your system allow you to investigate whether for certain operating conditions I have poor or good mixing. Well, here we have locally poor mixing. And I can demonstrate that now by way of two videos again. So on the left, we see the situation with these special stream tubes. On the right, we see a situation without these special stream tubes. And we again visualize the mixing by simply releasing dye. In this case, at the inlet. I release red dye at this position, green dye at that position. And the same in that other RAM. And the difference is just the operating condition and the locations of the windows. Now what you see here on the left, the red dye stays in a small, one of these special tubes. and therefore doesn't spread in the transverse direction. While the green dye does, it's released in the chaotic region. Here we have no such tubes, so here both the green and the red dye both spread in the transverse direction. So here we have a globally good mixing situation, what you want in this type of device. And here, well, the picture has vanished, but we had a poor mixing situation, and we can use that to systematically optimize the operating regime for in this case, the RAM. So I can just zoom in on the cross-sectional topology because that is sufficient, because these three-dimensional stream tubes emerge as islands here. So it's sufficient to just zoom in on the cross-sections. And I can do that as a function of the system parameters. And in this case, that's the residence time, or 1 over the flow rate, and the reorientation angle between the subsequent windows. And I can simply do that for this whole parameter regime. And then I get pictures like this. So here I see large islands appearing. And each island, again, is one of these special stream tubes. So something I don't want for mixing. But there is one region here in the lower right corner where I see no such islands anymore. So here I have global chaos. So from a mixing point of view, this is where I want to be. And this is a way to use these fundamental concepts to optimize a practical mixer in reality. So in this case, it was the rotated arc mixer. But the dynamics are the same for any inline mixer. So in any other inline mixer, I can do exactly the same. I can do a parameter study like this and identify these situations. And then I know I have a mixer which indeed mixes well. So this is a way to use these fundamental insights for practical analyses of, in this case, mixing devices. Okay. Yes. This was all simulations. How relevant is this? Well, the only way to determine that is by determining this in experiments. Do we indeed see the same behavior happening there as well? And that's the second part of this first topic. So the experimental mixing analysis. I will first briefly introduce the setup, and then I will use that setup for 2 experiments to actually validate those phenomena that we just saw. You may have to speed up a bit. Okay. So the challenge is, it's a 3-dimensional system, so it's quite difficult to have optical access for experiments. So what we actually do now is we have the original 3-dimensional RAM, but we represent it by a system which has the same dynamics, but which is easier to investigate in experiments. So we represent the 3-dimensional RAM by a 2-dimensional time periodic RAM. And the transverse flow now becomes the flow in the disk, so it becomes a 2-dimensional flow. And the actual evolution in the original 3-dimensional RAM now becomes an evolution in time. From a dynamic point of view, that is the same. But it's, again, much more accessible from an experimental point of view. So the downstream reorientation now becomes a periodic reorientation in time. So this is our original system. And that now becomes this system, 2-dimensional time periodic for the experimental analysis. Okay, so this is now the actual setup. So here you see a schematic of that system. So it is now a disk, very shallow layer of fluid, and the surface flow of that shallow flow is now our 2-dimensional flow representing our rotated arc mixer. And the walls are now driven as follows. So we have apertures on the side, and here we have small conveyor belts, and they can be turned on or turned off via electrical motors, and that represents this rotating outer cylinder. So this is our setup. And the measurement methods will be as follows. So we will do particle tracking of the surface flow or the 2-dimensional flow. So for the velocity field and also the Lagrangian trajectories. And we will also do dye visualizations to visualize the mixing patterns, as we will see later on. So let's now use that. First of all, to visualize this flow topology, and I will use as a case study now a 4-step RAM. So this is our 2-dimensional domain. We have 4 windows, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I can activate them one by one in this sequence. So each color represents the streamline pattern corresponding with all of the windows that I am activating at this moment. So we have a time periodic flow. And a way to visualize the flow topology is by so-called stroboscopic imaging. That is actually illustrated here. So here we see a juggler, which is juggling with juggling balls. And a way to visualize the dynamics of these juggling balls in this case is simply by illuminating them with a stroboscope. And then you get a picture like this. And that captures the dynamics of these juggling balls in this case in one image. And that is a technique known as stroboscopic imaging. Exactly that same technique we will use here. So here we have a periodic flow, and what we do now in the 2D RAM is we illuminate the flow at the end of each period And that gives us pictures like this, tracers here, here, and here. And that also captures via the stroboscopic imaging the dynamics inside this RAM. So that's the technique that we will use here. And that effectively gives us pictures like this. And those are effectively equivalent to the cross sections that we saw in the 3D RAM, this stroboscopic imaging. So that's our visualization technology. And we can simulate that as a reference. So if you simulate those stroboscopic images in the RAM as a function of the period time, you will find a picture like this. So for very short period times, you see one large island, and that will fall apart into regional non-mixing islands and regional chaotic seas, the larger the period time gets. So this is the predicted stroboscopic image in a 2D RAM as a function of the period time. Can we also see that in an experiment? Well, this is what we now do with our PTV experiments, particle tracking experiments. So we sprinkle the surface flow with tracer particles, we record them with the camera, and then we can obtain the stroboscopic images from that. We literally measure the position of the particles at the end of each period. Yeah, this is the measured stroboscopic image as a function of the period time. And this is the corresponding predicted stroboscopic image using simulations. And you see indeed a very close agreement. So for all these 4 periods, from completely non-chaotic at a low period time to largely chaotic at a high period time of the standard in this particular case, you see in all cases a very close agreement between what we measure and what we predict. So not just in terms of the overall structures, but also even in the terms of the smaller details. So this validates that indeed these topologies consisting of islands and of chaotic seas, as we have predicted in our computational analysis, they are existing in reality, and they also are robust. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to observe them in experiments. Okay, so this is first part of the mixing analysis, and so visualizing that flow topology. And now let's try to visualize also chaotic advection. And here I will zoom in on another case study. So before had a 4-step RAM, now we have 2 windows, but the principle is still the same. But for this analysis, it was more useful to use a 2-step RAM. So we only switch between 2 flows, but that's the only difference. And here we already zoom in on the situation where we have global chaos. So this is the stroboscopic image for that 2-step RAM. And we see one large chaotic cloud. So we have global chaos. So we expect here global chaotic advection based on this. And you can identify, and this is also a technicality that I will not go into detail, but you can identify in such a global chaotic region what I call special curves, here indicated by these red and blue curves. And they actually describe the stretching and folding pattern. So you may remember from my earlier illustration that chaotic advection is characterized by stretching and folding. And you can actually predict what particular pattern that will be by these so-called, by these special curves. They're also known as manifolds, by the way, but that is the stretching and folding pattern that you expect. That is also often referred to as the mixing template. And let's see whether we see that. So we now simply simulate the behavior of a concentration field, which has an initially circular position like this. And so this is simply a circular patch of dye. And let's now simulate how that will evolve in the course of time with the 2 walls. And so now this wall is activated. Now this one. And you see gradually this wall again. You see now gradually a certain pattern emerging during that evolution of that concentration field. And this is then the concentration field after a certain amount of time. And if you overlay that with the special curves, you see that it matches very closely. So indeed, these special curves, they define the particular pattern in which this chaotic advection happens. So this is all simulated. And yeah, the same question as before, is this also happening in reality? So we take our same 2-dimensional setup, and now we don't release tracer particles in that flow. Now we also create an initially circular blob of dye. So this is simply a glycerine, I think, with some dye stuff. So this is now our initial field in the experiment. And let's now see what happens here. Also first, this wall is activated. Now the one on the left. And now we switch back, and this goes now back and forth. And here you already qualitatively see a similar pattern emerging as what we saw before in the simulations. And this is then the sequence of snapshots corresponding with that. So this is the initial circular pattern. And that becomes more and more complicated in the course of time. So this is the evolution of time. And this is what we measure now in the experiment. And is this indeed corresponding with that mixing template that we predicted based on these special curves? Well, this is the experimental di-evolution, the top row. This is the simulated di-evolution, the bottom row. And visually they correspond very well. Indeed, if you now show that original mixing template, so this pattern defined by these special curves, we see indeed this correlates very closely with what we simulate, and that again correlates very closely with these special curves. And this is now an indirect visualization and thereby also a validation of that mixing template. We cannot directly measure these special curves as opposed to the flow topology, which we could measure directly. Here we cannot measure this directly, these curves, but based on the pattern that concentration field evolves during the course of time, we can infer that this must have been the underlying mixing template. So this is then an indirect visualization of that mixing template. So overall, we see that indeed our Lagrangian transport phenomena, and in particular the formation of these coherent structures and that emergence of that chaotic advection according to certain patterns, is indeed experimentally validated and thereby a useful concept for practical analysis. Okay, I'm speeding up a bit, but I should still be able to finish in time now. Okay, so that was the first topic. So this more application-oriented topic using these Lagrangian methods. Let's now move on to a second one, which is of a more fundamental nature, using those same concepts for the study of certain transport phenomena in 3D unsteady flows. And yeah, the approach will be the same, basically. So first of all, computational analysis, and then again, experimental validation of the phenomena that we observe in these simulations. Now we will consider a completely different type of flow. So what we will have now is a 3D cylinder as our flow domain, and it has a bottom wall and a top wall. And the flow inside that cylinder is now driven by translation of these two walls. So they can slide along the cylinder ends, and that will generate an internal flow. So a lid-driven cavity again, but now in three-dimensional form. So these arrows indicate possible directions in which the walls can translate. And if I only move the bottom wall in the x direction, for example, then this is the streamline pattern that I will get. I will get a large circulation cell, in this case oriented the x-axis. If I activate only the top wall, I will get the same, but then reflect. If I move in the y direction with the bottom wall, I have also the same field as this one, but then in the y instead of in the x direction. So this actually also is a sort of flow reorientation. By activating different walls, I get the same flow, but then simply a translation of that flow. And okay, some parameters, D is the dimensional displacement of the wall, L is the displacement of the wall during one step, and R is then the radius, and Reynolds number is another important parameter. And again, what I will do is I will set up periodic flows with that, but we will see in a minute what I mean by that. But this is the basic flow domain that we consider just a three-dimensional cylinder flow driven by the end walls. And let's now have a computational analysis of just some phenomena that we observe. We did actually a lot of work on that, but I will only show some results. And the first one is that you can actually expose, let's say, basic dynamical states as we refer to this. So for example, if you only activate the bottom wall, so you have first a translation in the x direction and a second translation in the y direction, and you repeat that in a periodic fashion, what you will then see is that tracer motion, so stroboscopic images will be restricted to invariant spheroids. So it may not be that obvious from this, but this is actually a spheroid. This is a two-dimensional flow within a surface. And there is an infinite family of these surfaces. It's not just one, it's infinitely many. So you can have larger and smaller of these spheroids that are concentrically arranged. You will find that the motion is always restricted to one of these invariant spheroids. So essentially, although I have a 3D flow, essentially I have two-dimensional dynamics. So what more complicated is if you translate the bottom wall in the x direction and the top wall in the minus x direction, and then you get a situation like this, what I refer to here as quasi-two-dimensional. So it's 3D flow in the sense that it is not restricted to a surface anymore, but that is restricted to a very thin layer. And that gives it a sort of quasi-two-dimensional nature. And the last situation to illustrate that is to include three steps. So I first translate in the x direction the bottom wall, then in the minus x direction by the top wall, and then in the plus y direction by the bottom wall again, and then repeat that. And then I get a situation like this, where I see tracers occupying the entire three-dimensional volume. This is a truly three-dimensional situation. So we have several basic dynamical states in one and the same 3D flow. 2D flow, restricted 2D motion, I should say, restricted to invariant spheroids in this case, quasi 2D, so restricted to thin layers and truly three-dimensional dynamics. But what I will zoom in for the remainder of this presentation is now this particular first case where the motion is restricted to invariant spheroids. It's the simplest case in this particular three-dimensional flow with respect to the dynamics, but it is nonetheless quite relevant for transport in, for example, geophysical flows. So in geophysical flows, because the atmosphere has a very small thickness compared to the radius, we have essentially quasi two-dimensional motion. So in atmospheric flows and geophysical flows, we have essentially motion restricted also to spheroids, actually to actual spheres. And that is from a dynamical point of view exactly the same as what we see in our cylinder flow for that particular forcing conditions. So we see oceanographic flow where the transport is taking place primarily in one layer. And the same can also happen in the atmosphere. So that is a practical situation, or a realistic situation, I should say. Geophysical flows, namely where this restriction to two-dimensional spheroids is quite important. And in general, we have not exact restriction to such layers, because what we usually have in the atmosphere and also in the oceans is some density gradient in the radial direction because of temperature variations, because of salinity variations. And that will usually lead to a situation like this. So in the case of temperature differences, this may be denser air. Denser air, heavier air will sink underneath lighter, warmer air, and you will get these kinds of circulations. So such radial density gradients will in general lead to local convection currents. So what we have is in general two-dimensional motion restricted to spheres, but subject to some perturbation in the radial direction by the emergence of convection cells. Okay, but what would now be the impact of that, of such local convection currents on Lagrangian motion? Well, our simple cylinder flow allows us to investigate that, because there, from a dynamical point of view, we have exactly that same situation. So let's see what may happen. And also here, first computationally, and then some experimental validation of the phenomena that we observe. So what we have is, let's say, a bottom line, namely a situation where I have no perturbation, which means in this case I have restriction of the tracer motion of the Lagrangian motion exactly to a spheroid, and that will be our baseline. And then from there on, we will see what will be the effect of perturbation on that baseline. And in our particular cylinder flow, we have that situation in the Stokes limit, where I only have forcing by translation of the bottom wall. No matter what sequence of forcings I take, if I only involve the bottom wall, I will always have these invariant spheroids to which my dynamics is being restricted. So I have essentially two-dimensional dynamics inside spheroids, but since it is a continuous family of spheroids, the dynamics in each of these spheroids is not the same. And it turns out here that if I move from the smaller spheroids to the larger spheroids, that the dynamics in general tend to evolve from less chaotic, so larger islands present to more chaotic. So smaller islands present to no islands present at all. But I will always have these two building blocks. So no matter what the spheroid size is that I am considering, or what spheroid I am considering, I will always have a topology that will have islands and chaotic seas in some arrangement. And yeah, again, it changes then in this case with the spheroid size. So this is our baseline. Also the situation in geophysical flows, in the most simplified situation, what will now happen if I perturb this? So in geophysical flows, perturbation by the emergence of convection cells. Here, what happens with some other form of perturbation, and we will see that this will actually be irrelevant. But let's simply see what happens if I perturb that situation. Well, the way we perturb here is by fluid inertia. So remember this baseline with the invariant spheroids was the Stokes limit, Reynolds is 0. What we will now do is we will introduce a very weak amount of fluid inertia in the flow. And notice the Reynolds number, 5 times 10 to the minus 3. So it's a tiny non-zero Reynolds number, but it will have a dramatic effect. Because what we saw in the two-dimensional situation, so in the Stokes limit, that we had motion restricted to spheroids, and that consisted locally of islands and chaotic seas. And they now respond to that inertia. Islands of neighboring spheroids now tend to merge into tubes. That is what happens with the islands. Chaotic seas on neighboring spheroids, they tend to form thin chaotic shells, and they do not coexist next to each other. They interact as well. So we see formation of cubes, we see formation of shells from the islands and the chaotic seas, and they connect and merge into tube and shell structures, and that's what you see here. So I have a very minor perturbation, 5 times 10 to the minus 3, by the Reynolds number in this case, and now I see very new structures emerging, given here. And this is actually one structure visualized by one tracer. So this is a stroboscopic image of one tracer. I start here, and then I see this tracer evolving around the tube, indicated in magenta, and then at some point it reaches the end of the tube, and then it starts moving in this chaotic shell, and then at some point it reaches the other side. So these are completely new, very complicated structures that emerge from the very weak perturbation of that initial situation. And something like this may apparently also happen then in oceanographic flows, for example, because the dynamics are the same. And important to note is that we now perturb by fluid inertia, but I can perturb any way I want. That will give the same result. So another way to perturb that is to maintain the Stokes limit. And now simply introduce a very weak motion by the top wall, maybe of 1,000th the strength of the motion of the bottom wall, the velocity of the bottom wall. And that has the same effect. So as long as the perturbations are very small, the nature of the perturbation doesn't matter. It will always result in something like this. So fluid inertia or top wall perturbation gives us the same response of the system to that perturbation. And it is actually much more universal than that. This is just a particular situation where I illustrate that. But if I look at that similar flow and I use completely different forcings, so in the previous example we had a sequence of forcings consisting of 2 steps, one along the x-axis, one along the y-axis, but I can also have different combinations of bottom wall translations, so different forcing conditions. I nonetheless get in a qualitative sense the same response. I see islands merging into tubes, I see chaotic seas merging into shells, and I see those two emerging into these complicated structures consisting of tubes and shells. So that is still within the similar flow, but even in a completely different flow. So here we have an external flow which is driven by a sphere. So this is a solid sphere which can rotate about various axes. And there we have the same. And the Stokes limit also dynamics restricted to invariant spheres. A tiny perturbation, and I see the same phenomenon. Shells emerging from chaotic seas, connected by tubes emerging from islands. So it's a very universal phenomenon, this particular response to perturbation. And again, because of this universality, it is very likely that we can see something similar in oceanographic flows, for example. We haven't examined that yet, but that's actually our next step. We also see that happening there. So a completely different flow than an oceanographic flow, still apparently capturing phenomena relevant for those flows. Okay, time-wise I'm still more or less okay. Those were all simulations, and yeah, also a bit complicated, but I still wanted to share that with you. The main question here for the moment is also, can we observe this in experiments? Is this a real robust phenomenon that we observe here? Well, therefore we do experiments. And in the interest of time, I will very quickly go over the setup. So it will essentially again be measurements of the 3D stroboscopic map by particle tracking, but now the 3-dimensional version of that. So we don't record tracer particles with one camera. We now record tracer particles with, in this case, 4 cameras. And that allows us to determine the 3-dimensional motion. But the basic idea is the same. It's only, in a technical sense, more difficult and more challenging to achieve. But it is essentially, again, PTV, but then the 3D counterpart of that. So let's quickly go over that. And yeah, one important thing, by the way, in the simulations, we have to impose a perturbation. So we have chosen different perturbations, so fluid inertia, top wall motion, etc. But we actively have to perturb the flow. Here we don't do that. Here we simply say, well, it's a realistic system. It's never perfect. So we always have some natural experimental imperfections present in our system. And if the system is indeed very sensitive to very small perturbations, then these imperfections should already be a natural perturbation. So we don't actively perturb this. We just rely on experimental imperfections. So this is a situation where they actually come in very handy. So let's see what happens. Well, here you see the result. So we have done these 3-dimensional PTV measurements without explicit perturbation, just in our cylinder flow. And this is what we observe. And it is actually more challenging and involved than what it may suggest here, but I'd simply go to the final result. It turns out that indeed we are able to measure that same behavior. So here we see the experimental stroboscopic image. So actually as measured with 3D PTV. And also here we have these two parts highlighted. So the magenta part is the cylinder formation part. The black part is the shell formation part, and indeed you see again a nice transition from motion along these tubes into these chaotic shells, exactly as we predict in the numerical simulations. And those are for your reference simulations. And you see indeed it's not exactly one-to-one correspondence, but it's a very delicate phenomenon. So we were already happy to see already agreement at this level. So I think it's safe to say that we have a close agreement between what we see in experiments and what we have simulated with actively imposed perturbations. So this might very well indeed capture relevant phenomena for oceanographic flows, but again, we haven't yet investigated that. And it carries a very interesting message, namely, since we have not imposed any perturbation here, since we simply rely on natural imperfections, apparently this perturbed state is the natural state in reality, because no system is perfect. So this is what you will see in reality, based on these results. Okay, so that's the end. Let's finish with some concluding remarks. And those are general, very general remarks. So what we saw is that the Lagrangian approach is actually quite essential for in-depth studies of transport. So you saw that this is useful and basically also necessary to properly investigate industrial mixers. We saw that this allowed us to systematically analyze fundamental transport phenomena with potential relevance for geophysical flows. And very important to highlight here is that we can only do this with this Lagrangian approach. So you really have to zoom in on the actual motion of the material, of the fluid elements, of material regions. So using just the Eulerian flow field or instantaneous streamline patterns will not allow you to really investigate that at full depth. So this Lagrangian approach for this particular kind of problem, maybe transport, is really essential to obtain these insights. And yeah, what we saw is that the experimental studies were able to demonstrate the physical validity of the phenomena that I've shown. And this is also something that should be part of any study, and make sure that you indeed see these phenomena in reality. So that allowed us to demonstrate that these coherent structures that we use for the optimization of mixers indeed exist, and that they are thereby robust. They also showed us to demonstrate, allowed us to demonstrate that we can have a very unexpected and delicate response to perturbation. And yeah, again, in order to make these results practically relevant and practically meaningful, you have to do experiments. And okay, what is some ongoing and future work? Well, a very important challenge is still to bring this to the practitioners and to make engineers use these methods to optimize their mixers, for example. This is still a big challenge. So you may want to develop CFD modules that allow engineers to use that for actual purposes. So bridging gap to practice is still a big challenge. And also extending that to other transport problems than just in industry. So these phenomena are not just potentially relevant for mixing devices, but we saw already a nice connection with geophysical flows, but also inside our body, physiology, hemodynamics, etc. So non-technical disciplines, if you like, could still benefit a lot from insights into such transport phenomena. And of course, with respect to the dynamics themselves, for two-dimensional systems, a lot is already known. For three-dimensional systems, on the other hand, a lot is still not known. So there should also be a stronger focus, I think, on essentially three-dimensional transport phenomena. Okay, that was all I wanted to share with you today. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Yes, you mentioned the special curves in your 2D case. What are they exactly? Are they like unstable periodic orbits?
Yeah, what you can identify in these flows, in these two-dimensional flows, are fixed points, and there are several kinds of them. And one kind of fixed point is, or they also are referred to as periodic points, with particular material points in the flow, and connected with those are manifolds. And they actually, these manifolds actually determine the principal directions of transport. So these I refer to them as special curves for the sake of simplicity, but they are well defined and well understood. So they are essentially the stable and unstable manifolds of hyperbolic fixed points. So that's their origin.
You don't have a periodic orbits or anything like this?
You did have periodic orbits in that flow because it was a periodic flow, and so you have certain material elements, fluid elements, that simply return to their initial position, and that is a periodic point. And they have, under certain conditions, these special curves, these manifolds. So that part is well understood, but I didn't go into detail because of time. So that it's well known that they exist, but yeah, the validation indirectly via the streamline patterns, etc., that was often still an outstanding question.
The other question I had is in geophysical flow, what would be the corresponding part of the correspondence of your periodic changes? Because in a way, the main oceanic currents or the main atmospheric currents, they are really structured in space, and they don't switch on and off periodically.
No, it's a first connection. So the primary connection with geophysical flows was that you have a restriction of your dynamics to two-dimensional sphere-like surfaces, where you indeed have this nice periodic forcing, and the geophysical flow is something else. But on the other hand, we have the 24-hour cycle and traction, etc., by the moon. So I think that even in geophysical flows, there are situations where you, I think, to good approximation, have periodic forcing as well. But again, the main correspondence was with the type of the dynamics, restriction to two-dimensional surfaces, and their response to perturbation. So that may very well be very similar in a non-periodic flow, but that we don't know that. It was really a first connection that we made. So a potential application of that of these insights. Yeah.
So
Okay.
So regarding the first topic, so for the inline mixers, you had two behaviors. One behavior where the structures restrict preventing the mixing, a bad case, and the good case where you had the chaotic advection. So what are the initial conditions that lead to one behavior and the initial conditions that lead to the other behavior?
It's not really the initial conditions because those all concerned steady flows. It's really the provision of forcing conditions. So you have an axial flow, you have a certain flow rate, and there's also a certain rotation rate of the cylinder which drives the transverse flow, and there's also a certain geometry, so the different positioning of the windows with respect to each other. So those, so let's say the geometry of the device and the actual flow rate, those are two parameters that you can vary, and under certain conditions you see that in this parameter regime you see these special stream. Yes, in fact.
You talked about good mixing being the result of global vertical folding.
In this Lagrangian perspective, again, I said in the beginning, we ignore diffusion and we zoom in completely on advection only, and then these concepts are developed for that limit. If you have diffusion, you can also have transport across coherent structures. That makes it more complicated.
Yeah, you need diffusion for mixing. You don't really talk about stirring, obviously.
Yeah, that is. I mean,
make another point. You talked about how to mix well. You didn't say much about how to mix fast and how to mix with little energy input.
That's a good question. This was primarily mixing analysis in a qualitative sense. So let's say in an inline mixer, for example, the first criterion in order to have a good mixing situation is absence of such tubes, of these special stream tubes.
Yeah, for good mixing.
Yeah, that's at least a qualitative criterion that I have to fulfill. If I have such special stream tubes, I always have a problem. So the first thing I want to get rid of is such stream tubes. And then you have, let's say, a certain regime in parameter space. And inside that regime, you could still further optimize for the most efficient in terms of the quickest way to have mixing. That could be a second level of optimization, but here we just focused on the, let's say, the topological part.
So for the quickest way of having mixing, would you follow pairs of fluid elements rather than just one fluid element? Would you, the Lagrangian view would perhaps be more than one of two pairs, rather than two particles rather than one?
Yeah, there are several ways. You can have you can use standard measures like density segregation or whatever, or entropy. There are several measures by which you can quantify the mixing rate. And then, depending on what measure you use, choosing one of those measures allows you to also optimize in a quantitative sense. So, what is the quickest way to achieve mixing?
You mentioned mixing rate. Do you expect an exponential mixing rate or a parallel mixing rate?
In principle, exponential, because chaotic advection results in, at least chaotic advection results in exponential extension, usually exponential stretching. So based on that, I would first of all expect something tending towards exponential mixing rates.
Rather than super exponential. Rather than super exponential.
Oh, I wouldn't be able to answer. To be honest, I wouldn't be able to answer that right away. I focus only on this, let's say, topological part. So I do not dare to answer this question at this point. In our research, at least, we didn't focus on that. We focused primarily on this topology.
Yeah, fair enough.
So the coherent structures and all their absence.
That's I think because of the obvious impact on the mixing.
Question: beyond the CFD, is there a hope to make some models and to try to get the parameters to go beyond this and to prevent these tubes without chaotic mixing? Actually, here you predict, you try, but is there a way to predict with a simple model, let's say?
Yeah,
without doing this kind of CFD, let's say.
No, I don't think so, because it depends on the actual flow, whether or not you have islands or these special stream tubes, for example. So if you have a simplified version of that flow, you may lose the necessary information to do a correct prediction. So in an actual flow, in an actual mixer, you would like to have the actual flow field.
And one of the things for a single flow is more finding the flow that gives you the best global kills.
Yeah, that is the same system, but the operating conditions, so the actual flow rate, for example, or the positioning of the windows in the case of the RAM, or if you have a standard mixer, a static mixer, they have internal baffles. So their reorientation, their length, their shape, those are all parameters that you can use to manipulate that behavior, and then find the situations where you don't have these special stream tubes.
Yeah, I actually have two questions regarding the last setup you considered with the spheroids. So the first question is related to the break of symmetries, because basically you pass from a shell-like dynamics to an interconnected dynamics between the shells, and to be due to a secondary to inertia due to boundary presence, because I mean that's if you pass from Stokes flow to from pure Stokes flow to quasi Stokes flow, basically you develop a secondary flow due to the presence of the boundaries, which somehow can drive the flow from a spheroid to another, and that's supposed to tend to its amplitude to zero. The more with Reynolds number that tends to zero, is this correct? Or?
Yeah, if you look at our flow, so in the Stokes limit we see these spheroids, and you can actually show that then the flow must have a constant of motion, invariant, and that vanishes as soon as you no longer are in the Stokes limit. That's it, and that is essentially indeed a form of symmetry breaking. So then, a certain symmetry vanishes, and thereby also the existence of that constant of motion vanishes, and then also the spheroids vanish. So it is in that respect a form of symmetry breaking. You no longer satisfy the Stokes limit, and thereby certain symmetries are gone.
Yeah, so basically, so if we yeah, and that leads to the second question. So if we take the quasi stocks, let's say flow, so in case in which the Reynolds number is not exactly zero, but it's kind of small, what we see are these tubes which are basically hypersurfaces which represent like quasi-periodic trajectories for a particle. Now the question is, if we take the limit for Reynolds number tending to zero, can we chop these tubes with the spheroidal surface and find back the islands which we would get in the Stokes flow?
Yes. If I understand your question correctly, I mean these tubes, they really emerge. They are actually neighboring circles. So in the Stokes limit, I have actually each island is actually a circle. Basically, it's a closed orbit in itself. And if you very weakly perturb that, you see a tube which is simply these spheres or these circles merging. I think that is your question.
Yeah,
so the circles are no longer closed. They open up a tiny little bit, and that leads to a spiraling motion, very weak, because the tracers, they travel very weakly along the axis of the tube. It's not very quick. It takes thousands of periods to simulate that. Yeah. And that also made it such a big challenge in the experiments to be able to measure that very delicate phenomenon.
So in a certain sense, in this framework, if we wanted to connect Eulerian topology and Lagrangian topology, we would say that the Eulerian secondary flow observed when we are not strictly in Stokes regime would add a drifting velocity to the periodic orbit on the Stokes flow that breaks the spheroidal symmetry and drags the trajectories from circular trajectories to spheroidal trajectories.
Yeah, you could see it like that indeed. If you look at the velocity vectors, etc., as soon as you have a very weak perturbation, you see that the velocity vectors are no longer tangential to the spheroids. They very weakly lead to some transverse motion, and that is enough to cause that drifting, as you say, indeed. And that is what underlies that that merging of these islands into tubes, for example.
So it's actually not a singular limit, but basically it's like mathematically speaking, probably we don't get any. It's simply like a symmetry breaking, which does not involve any singular limit.
No, I wouldn't. If I understand your question correctly, I wouldn't consider it as such. No.
Thanks.
I mean, the topology itself doesn't really change. Other than that, there's a very weak drifting superimposed. It's not that it completely changes.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yes, I have a question about your perturbation. It's, if I will understand here, it's like
you mean in the experiments?
Yeah.
Yeah, there are many imperfections. I mean, the experimental setup, it's not a perfect cylinder because very weak perturbations already trigger this phenomenon. So we have several candidates. We didn't really investigate what the actual experimental imperfections were, but you always have them. The cylinder is not perfectly circular. The translating bottom, for example, is not perfectly aligned with it because there's a very tiny gap, because otherwise you induce vibrations. So we have to leave a very small gap between the translating wall and the cylinder. That is never perfectly aligned. The tracer particles are not perfectly passive, etc., etc. There is also, we have some suspicion about some very weak convection because we illuminate the flow with LEDs because you need a strong illumination to make the particles visible for the camera, and that sends thermal energy into the flow, and that can lead to very weak convection. So those are all candidates that can contribute to that natural perturbation, but we didn't really investigate is there one dominating natural perturbation present.
And I have another question that if your perturbation is it's a large scale perturbation, but with a small amplitude, do you think they will also have the same response to each perturbation?
But what do you mean large scale by small? I mean this. You mean large scale everywhere?
No, I mean that the perturbation with in the low V number.
Yeah, with much higher Reynolds numbers, for example. Then you see, I didn't show that, but then you see a dramatic difference. So if you do the same analysis and you go up to a Reynolds number of say 10 or 100 or so, and then you see that these structures completely vanish. Everything is completely gone.
So it means that the response is always identical for all distribution, all types of distribution of the perturbation.
Possibly, we don't know. We just investigated here what happens if I just do this. And the other extreme, if I really kick it like a Reynolds is 100. But it would be very interesting to see if I smoothly change from a Reynolds to 10 to the minus 3 that we investigated up to, let's say, a Reynolds 100, and then with a continuous variation, do I see some regimes, for example, of response? We didn't investigate that. It was really this limit of very weak versus a very strong perturbation. And in particular, this response to these very weak perturbations really surprised us. And that's why we zoomed in on that. So the story is certainly not complete.
So maybe we can check if there are some questions from the.
Oh yeah, there's also.
Yeah, there is a question in the chat. Maybe you can.
Let me see if I can see that. Should that be in the
report if you want?
Yeah, maybe that's better. Yeah, let's do it that way.
So Henrik Kuhlmann, he asks regarding the modeling of inline mixers for your nice experiment close to the Healy show. How about the dependence of the axial velocity on the distance from the axis of inline mixers? So the dependence of the axial velocity on the distance from the axis on inline mixers.
The radial profile.
Maybe he can. Henrik, can you activate your mic?
Yeah, I have my mic, but my connection is very bad. Therefore, I tried to post the question in the chat. I assume that in the real inline mixers, the axial velocity is the highest near the axis, and a fluid element near the axis then would see a larger frequency of the azimuthal motion, but this cannot be somehow modeled in the two-dimensional model experiment. Is that true, or am I wrong? By the way, I enjoyed the talk, and you have very nice experiments, so congratulations.
Well, thank you for that. And you are right. If you look at the two-dimensional version of the RAM in that case, that would correspond to a plug flow in a real 3D situation. So in the 3D RAM, we have a Poseidon profile. And in the 2D RAM, of course, you have a uniform evolution in time, which in a 3D situation would correspond with a plug flow. So that is a difference, but that is only that doesn't really change the dynamics in a qualitative sense. But you cannot one-to-one translate the results from the 2D RAM back to the 3D RAM, only in a qualitative sense. And our primary challenge was to see whether we can indeed see these same stroboscopic maps, so these islands and these chaotic seas. So that was our main objective in that experimental study. And then, I think we validated that. But indeed, if you want to have a closer quantitative comparison, you would have to resort to an actual 3D experiment.
Okay,
so that's clearly not in one-to-one.
Yeah, so I then in your numerics you also use plug flow, right?
Yes, so I indeed at some point I showed these stroboscopic images, and those were also done with a 2D rammer. So that was a simulated situation which was in one-to-one correspondence with the experimental setup.
Okay, thank you very much.
I do have a question regarding the same system. Does the physics of the resonance which breaks the islands change passing from the plug flow to the Poisson-like 3D flow?
We didn't investigate that, to be honest. So that actually connects to Hendrik's question, I think. Yes. So we didn't really do a study with respect to what is the impact if I have, let's say, a plug flow versus a Poisson profile. Because in a qualitative sense, you expect the same transversal topology. So let's say islands and chaotic seas. But exactly what the impact would be on the particular arrangement, for example, of islands by the axial flow, so Poisson versus plug, we didn't investigate that. It will have an impact, I'm quite sure about that. But for the qualitative validation of the existence of these kinds of topologies, I think it's not really important.
Yeah, because it seems that basically the number of the resonance you have, it seems strongly connected to the periodicity of your driving. Because when you showed the inline mixers with 3 windows which were kind of uncovered along the axis of the mixers, you got a period 3 breakage of your like a period 3 sim.
So I mean, I can imagine that such phenomena may very well depend very strongly on the axial profile. Yeah.
Whereas afterwards you had like a 4 periodic driving, and you got a resonance which was.
Yeah. No, again, I can imagine that this will have quite some impact, but for the, let's say, the overall dynamics, the qualitative dynamics, that was not relevant, at least not for our study.
Let's see if there is someone else who would like to ask a question. So just once again, feel free to mute your mic or write in the chat if you have any question. Okay, so this doesn't seem to be the case. So maybe just
You can do something here.
No, I think we can close the webinar. So it was a great talk. So thanks a lot for this very detailed and explanatory talk. And so thanks to everyone for participating. And today was the last webinar of the semester. We will start once again with webinars from end of September or middle of September. So thanks again, Michel, for the talk today.
Thank you. Thank you for your interest. So it's good to see this large interest. So thank you very much for that.
Yes.
Thank you very much indeed.